Welcome to the second part of my lecture series on the unconscious. Today we're focusing on the world and how the sense of world incorporates the unconscious as the kind of section of the world that is not disclosed to us, the kind of inherent concealment of the world. I want to start off by mentioning something that I've read in the exchanges between Carl Jung and the physicist Wolfgang Pauli, and that is the notion of synchronicity. Now, synchronicity is that missing part of the puzzle. Jung has often talked of the quaternio, or the quaternity, of time, space, causality, which Kant focused on as well when constructing his critical idealism, but missing out a fourth part. There's always the kind of missing fourth, the parting fourth. The very first video on this channel explains the quaternity quite more in detail. If you want, you can check it out. So this fourth part is the counterpart to causality, and that is synchronicity. That is a sort of correlation that seems to be meaningful, that seems to be somehow striking some sort of chord between the kind of psychic and the physical, and that emerges from an initial unity of the both, that essentially they are not separable. And this has been discovered especially with Wolfgang Pauli, who had been complaining about, one could say, psychic ills. So there was this Pauli effect where he would be barred from laboratories because as soon as he entered, everything would fail. I perhaps could say similar things about my own relationship to technology. Perhaps a lot of you do too. And the important discovery there was the Pauli exclusion principle at the time, which said that no two particles, no two electrons, for example, could be in the same state. So they could only be distinguishable if they were in two different states, and could never be in the same state. It could only be, an electron could only be in the same state with itself. And the way that electrons would arrange themselves in different states, for example, spin up, spin down, is non-causal. It would happen synchronistically, in the same way as entangled quantum systems would seem to be correlated in a way that enabled a change of states over light speed. And this sort of entanglement, however, wasn't capable of transferring classical information, so it wasn't causal in a sense, it was synchronistic in a sense. One could only post hoc recognize that there had been some sort of meaningful coincidence happening. And this meaningful coincidence was a concept that Jung had explored for quite some time, namely the concept of synchronicity. And in this sense, it is important to see here how the kind of world emerges from something that was even before the spatial and temporal limitations that we have kind of constructed now in our sciences by creating these abstractions of space and time. And so Jung is said to have said that the psyche is not located within the individual, but that much rather the individual lives within the psyche. So there is this kind of mutual containing each other within each other, which can also be found in explanations of consciousness, such as the strange loop, where something just keeps looping into each other, like A contains B, B contains A, and it is hard to wrap your head around it. And in order to find a more philosophical basis for this sort of Jungian worldview, in order to give this a proper philosophical foundation, we need to dig deeper into the works of Martin Heidegger. So Heidegger, he, in his main work, arguably Being and Time, developed an idea that he referred to as Dasein, which translates roughly to being there. And Dasein, or in der Welt sein, so being in the world, was the primordial mode of being out of which all this separation of subject and object, one and the many, the discrete and the continuous kind of arose, or psyche and physis. So it is something that is more primordial and is not something that originates from a polar opposition, but more an ontological distinction between being and beings, between Sein and Seiendes. So Dasein was more that being which seems to have some relationship to being, which stands in the light of being, as he would put it. Now, one could see that one could describe this sort of philosophy as the kind of classical sense of philosophy and metaphysics after it had gone through the Nietzschean abyss that dissolved all concepts as such. And the ontological distinction is, of course, very similar to what we've talked about in the first episode about the distinction between the narrator and the character, the narration and the narrator. It is not a polar opposition, it is an ontological distinction. So this, the ignorance, or as Heidegger would call it, Seinsvergessenheit of this ontological distinction, that is which leads to the kind of establishment of polar opposites. So this ignorance led to the establishment of the polar opposition of subject and object, and at the same time it leads to the polar opposition in the identity of the ego with its shadow, or in terms of, let's say, symbolic genders, it is the anima and the animus, the male, the masculine and the feminine soul. So what was attempted was to reconcile these opposites philosophically, as Heidegger did, and thus he would provide a ground on which the psychological system of Jung could rest on. And it is a system that is not something that can be established as a, let's say, institutionalized, departmentalized science, but it is that which provides perhaps the spark or the kind of torch that may lead us through the tunnel of technological darkness and technological nihilism, which most of the sciences are now bound to follow into. And which we can see especially now with increasing, let's say, unsurmountability of these mountains of data, and they are increasingly only processable by algorithms and bots and programs which humans cannot fathom. And so what Jung saw in the conjunctio of the alchemists, what Jung saw in this kind of reconciliation, the coincidence of opposites, was kind of philosophically pursued by Heidegger in this alternative way to the mutual reconciliation of the dialectic of Hegel. So instead of speaking of a continuous dialectic, the kind of core of that dialectic, the kind of unfathomable undisclosedness and concealment of that which lies at the heart of being in the world, was put at the center. So in a way it is a form of renewed mysticism without having any metaphysical baggage about the mysticism. So we do not talk about some sort of other spiritual world in this case. And one can see what happens to the philosophical system, which was anticipated by Hegel and then transitioned into Marxism, and then, for example, the critical theory of the Frankfurt School, where you have this sort of destruction and dissolution of opposites, where the irreconcilability is that which is focused on, and instead of them being reconciled, instead of what Heidegger would call verwinden, instead of überwinden, so kind of resolving, disentangling by twisting out of it instead of overcoming it. This is it for this part, and I will continue in the next video.